rebuttal that the checks that are seen now are self-imposed checks through lack of efficient means of distribution? Well,
yes. You could argue with him, and you could say, no, it's not about the amount of food, it's about the distribution of food. There's plenty of food for everybody. It's just that it's not distributed in a way that supports everyone. Just like there's plenty of water, if it were properly managed and handled, and it weren't so inequitably distributed, right? And you can make that argument. However, he could then turn around and say, well, then you're just going to keep more people alive, and you'll have more people. And then what are you going to do? Again, the argument he set up is logically and empirically impregnable. It is immune to disproof. Any example of anybody dying anywhere on the face of the earth can, under his framework, be seen as evidence, empirical evidence in support of his argument. It's a check. Any circumstance in which it appears that he's wrong because there's enough food, there's plenty of food, there's just problems, he can say, well, this hasn't happened yet. This is part of what makes his argument so compelling to so many people on an intuitive level, and even as you go out and you try to find instances of it. You look around, you go find any case of misery, it's proof that he's right. It's, on the one hand, it's this magically powerful argument. On the other hand, it is, any argument that is immune to disproof and immune to empirical evidence can only be characterized as an idealistic piece of circular nonsense, right? This, it's just amazing how persistent this framework, this theory, this way of thinking about things has been since his time. And we'll see it again and again. So what are some of these checks? He talks first about plants and animals. He says the result of this contradiction, or this tension between these opposing forces, natural abundance and scarce or finite resources, is for plants and animals waste of seed, sickness, and premature death. Right? There are plenty of plants that produce, 1 million times as many seeds as ultimately survive and germinate and reproduce. Right? Great example of the kind of thing he's talking about. Waste of seed. And waste of seed has got a religious overtone too, doesn't it? Right? This is a sign of moral failing in humans, at least according to certain doctrines. In people, the result is misery and vice. Misery if there are people who are starving and suffering, sort of physical deprivation. Vice, what is the principal vice that he seems to be thinking about when he introduces this component of the check on humans? Anybody know? Yeah. Primitive methods of birth control. That's one. Others? When you read this and you think about, he's constantly sort of glancing along, bouncing off of the question of what is prudent and responsible in the decision to marry, right? He's very concerned about men who marry and have children whom they can't support. And he considers the lower classes to be particularly guilty of this, right? It's seen as not just a mistake, but actually a moral failing, a fault of deep moral implication. One of the vices he's talking about here, I kid you not, is prostitution, is sex out of marriage. He says the responsible thing to do is to not get married until you have a career and an income that will support having a family. And he was probably acutely aware of this himself, right? He suggests that what this means is that people delay marriage. And what do they do when they delay marriage? Does that mean they simply abstain? It means they do all kinds of vicious things, right? That's one of the vices he's worried about, believe it or not. But that's, basically figuring out how to satisfy that passion between the sexes without having children is a big category of vice for him. So, other questions? Yeah?
So he was born to a free-thinking family, yet they were very religious, is that right?
He was born to a free-thinking family. His father was not particularly religious. This is a time in history when, if you're a respectable person of the upper classes, you don't go around advertising the fact that you're not religious, right? You don't really want to publicly state that you're not a member of the church, you don't believe in God, right? So his father was not a sort of outspoken campaigning atheist, right? But very few people were. But his father was not that religious, and in fact, in many ways, this whole book issues out of a dispute with his father about the idea of perfectibility or not. And yes, Malthus, even coming from a free-thinking family, he could, it made sense in some way for him to become a parson. It was a respectable thing to do. Malthus himself was a religious man, but let's just say he was trying to sort of negotiate these conflicting arguments and inclinations on his own part. What's a redundant population? Any ideas? If you suggest that there is such a thing, doesn't that leave you trying to decide who it is? Who are the redundant people? In his time, the obvious answer was people who lacked food, shelter, jobs, or wealth. People who were dependent on charity or public relief to make ends meet. People who were exposed to higher risks of disease, malnutrition, crime, accidents, disasters, and so forth. These were the people who were falling under the checks of this principle of population. And their redundancy was evident in the streets of London and other cities at the time. This sounds familiar, doesn't it, right? That you look at a picture, if someone's trying to say there are too many people in the world, they're likely to show you a picture in which you see a lot of poor, deprived people. That the sort of teeming slums of the third world are used as somehow evidence of this, right? The point to understand is that in Malthus's time, this was a recent phenomenon. This was something that people couldn't figure out, and they were deeply troubled by it. First, there was the question of where all these people had come from. Why were there suddenly large numbers of paupers and poor people in the streets of London and wandering around the countryside? There hadn't been this kind of phenomenon on this scale before. Why were they poor at a time when the nation, Great Britain, was becoming more and more rich? It didn't make sense. There was all this progress and economic activity, abundances of goods. Trade was growing rapidly. How could it be that there were more poor people now than there had been 100 years before? What might these people do? What if they organized and revolted against their circumstances? Bread riots were a fairly common occurrence. That kind of thing had been going on for a long time. Price of bread gets too high. The folks in that area take over, right? They rise up. They storm the bakery and take the bread. These kinds of small-scale uprisings in the name of having enough food to eat were commonplace. They had a long history, but now there was the specter of huge numbers of people, not just the local village population of farmers, but entire sort of urban conglomerations of people in the streets who might do this kind of thing. Karl Polanyi, who wrote a magnificent economic history of this period of time, says, when the significance of poverty was realized, the stage was set for the 19th century. Poverty was novel. Poverty, as we think of it now, was a new and mysterious problem. Where had it come from? And how to make sense of it? In many ways, this is the image in Malthus's mind and the mind of his readers that makes the idea of a redundant population make some sense. It gives some purchase to that image of a redundant population. There's this problematic of political economy. And as I said, he's the first professor of political economy. Adam Smith and a handful of others had sort of put this problematic together, but it was a recent phenomenon, trying to make sense of the relationship among all of these component factors: money, land, labor or population, law and government, capital and value. The context was one in which mercantile capitalism was well established. This was capitalism based largely in trade. Huge quantities of goods moving between India, other parts of the Orient, Africa, the slave trade, the West Indies, sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, cotton plantations in North America. Vast amounts of stuff getting produced and traded, and that trade is generating huge surpluses of wealth that are accumulating in large measure in Great Britain. A lot of that wealth is being invested into a new kind of capitalism, industrial capitalism. Many of these mercantile capitalists, either directly or through the intermediaries of banks, are taking that money and spending it to build factories, to modernize agriculture, agricultural improvement. Vast areas in Great Britain are in the process of being converted from more or less feudal arrangements in which you had peasants sort of tied to the land producing food. A lot of the lords of those properties are deciding, no, I don't want these peasants here anymore, because producing food is not the best, most rational, economical way of using my land. I can make a lot more money if I get rid of those peasants and turn that land into pasture for sheep. Because the mills, the woolen mills in the cities, are getting bigger and demanding more and more wool, and the price of wool is very high. And I can raise more sheep and make more money by shearing those sheep and taking that wool to market than I can by allowing these peasants to continue to farm. And what's called the enclosures are going on. Enclosures meaning that lands that had previously been common or held sort of in trust, or not legally in trust, but held in connection with the people living there. The people living there had a kind of inheritable right to be there and raise food. Those lands are being enclosed and treated as the property of individuals who are making economic decisions about how they can best make a living. So-called primitive accumulation. This is how Marx characterized it. And primitive in the original German actually means original accumulation. It's not intended to mean primitive in some kind of anthropological sense. This is a combination of developments in which serfs, peasants, previously agricultural populations are being uprooted, denied access to those lands to farm any longer, and they are moving into cities because there's sort of no other place for them to go. And the lands that they've been using are being converted to sheep pasture or otherwise improved. And you have suddenly this population in cities, many of whom are going to work in these mills and other factories, but many of whom have not yet found work. These are the people who are the apparently redundant population of the time. The redundant population necessarily occasioned by the prevalence of early marriages must be repressed by occasional famines and by the custom of exposing children. What's exposing children? Walking away from them, literally. Exposing them to whatever might befall them, right? These are examples of, again, misery and vice, right? These are the people who symbolize this problem, this new problem of poverty. For a lot of the preceding debate, the issue at the core of this problematic was morality, right? A person who was poor and destitute could be said to simply be immoral. They aren't living up to, abandoning your child. Come on, that's totally immoral. How can you? It must be that you're somehow you're not virtuous enough. And that sort of thread runs through Malthus's argument as well. But at the same time, really, to the extent that there's a progressive part of his argument, it's to suggest that no, this is actually about the market, and we can think about the market in terms of social science and displace the kinds of theological or moralistic reasoning that had characterized a lot of previous efforts to think about this. In other words, let's go look at the way markets work and think about how they can be understood and improved and address these questions that way. And to the extent that Malthus deserves credit, he deserves credit for contributing to this shift in focus away from purely moralistic accounts of why a person was poor or why they had to abandon their child or why they drank to economics, right? It's not to say that his economics themselves are that great, but the larger gist of what he was promoting as a sort of empirical science had represented something of a step forward. Now, the context of this is worth exploring a little bit further. At the time that he wrote, and he mentions the Poor Laws, right? And he calls for the Poor Laws to be overturned and eliminated. What were the Poor Laws? The Poor Laws were a series of measures, laws passed in Great Britain over many centuries, in fact, that attempted to deal with those people who did not have enough to eat. And it was organized by parish, and it was funded under the laws of his day by a tax on employment. So business keepers and people who employed other people paid a tax into the parish coffers, and the parish coffers were used to provide alms for the poor. Bread, right? It was guaranteed under the Spendeman Law as a right to live. And the amount you were given moved with the price of bread to ensure that you had enough money to buy a certain quantity of bread, depending on whether you were just trying to feed yourself and your spouse or some children. And it had perverse interactions with something called the Settlement Act, which said that you couldn't go looking for alms for support under the Poor Laws except in the parish in which you were registered. And this, there are obvious reasons why this kind of thing would get passed, right? To try to control the amount of people coming looking for alms, for charity. So you had to register in one parish and stay there if you wanted to be eligible. Now, there's been a long debate about whether the poor laws made the problems of that period what they were or not. Under a preceding prevalent historical interpretation associated with Karl Polanyi, the poor laws had a number of nefarious effects that actually made the situation worse. And you can sort of imagine this yourself. If you're employing someone and you're paying a tax into the coffers, and you know that anybody who doesn't make a certain amount of money can go to the parish and get what they need to make up for their shortfall, this has the effect essentially of allowing employers to lower wages. And there's evidence that this may have happened, at least in certain parts of England at the time, that employers came to feel that they didn't need to pay very much because any difference could be made up by the employee just going to the parish and getting relief there that would supplement the wages that they were earning. That this stymied productivity, punished small farms and businesses, distorted economic relations. The settlement acts prevented people from moving from where they were to where there were jobs. Right? If they moved, they lost their support because they were no longer where they belonged, and therefore they couldn't go where there were jobs, and there were places where there were jobs, but they couldn't find any labor. Increased poverty rather than decreasing it. I'm about to run out of time here. There is more recent economic historical research to suggest that, in fact, the poor laws were not the cause of this problem. That the cause of this problem was the Napoleonic Wars and the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. And that basically there was the war caused an increased demand for food, for wheat, which drove up the price, created a lot of a disparity between what wages were and the cost of bread. And that following the Napoleonic Wars, there was an agricultural depression in which there was surplus production and people got laid off. And that both of these things created this situation of great widespread poverty. I guess I will have to pick this up on Thursday because I'm out of time. We'll see you then.